first, let's talk with the big news. It's what everybody is talking about, the James Harden trade. There are so many dynamics at play with this trade. We'll get to all of them, but first, the trade details. That seems like a pretty good place to start. The Rockets get Victor Oladipo, Rodions Kurucs, Dante Exum, 4 unprotected first-round picks from Brooklyn in 2022, 2024, and 2026, and also Milwaukee's 2022 first-round pick. Rockets also get 4 unprotected first-round pick swaps in 2021, 2023, 2025, and 2027. And for those of you who are more casual basketball fans, first-round pick swaps essentially means that if the Nets are worse than the Rockets in any of the years that these picks are eligible, so in 2021, 23, 25, and 27, if the Nets are worse by any miracle to the Rockets during those years, it just means that these teams get to swap first-round picks. So in the end, Rockets getting 8 first-round picks, a couple of players, and they're getting their big nuisance out of Houston, which is good. The Nets get James Harden, obviously. That's the big piece that the Nets are shelling out for. The Pacers get Karis LeVert in a 2023 second-round pick from Houston. And then the Cavaliers get Jarrett Allen and Taurean Prince from the Nets. Jarrett Allen, an exciting young center, really a crucial part of the Nets rebuild, I guess you could say, of the last 3 years. I mean, the Nets were terrible for a while after they sold their souls in 2013 to get Paul Pierce and Kevin Garnett. We're going to talk about that a little bit as well. Very, very similar trades in terms of how Sean, I'm forgetting his last name, Nets general manager, is basically selling the team's soul to get these all-star players. So Jarrett Allen, a really good piece for the Nets when he was there. The Cleveland Cavaliers are going to get a really good player in Jarrett Allen. That's a great pickup. This is one of the very few trades, I think, in recent memory in which you could take a look at what everybody got, and you could say, yeah, I think every team that was involved ended up actually getting what they were going for. There was no team that ended up being a fourth wheel, somebody that's at the edge of the table as opposed to in the center of the booth, and it really feels like every single team won this trade in some aspect. Now, the one team that you can argue lost the trade is the 76ers, and you can't say that they lost the trade because they technically weren't involved in the trade. They didn't give anything. They didn't receive anything, but they were the other team in contention with the Nets to get James Harden. They were reportedly offering Ben Simmons, and I'm not sure if there was anything else involved. Then it comes down to, well, how much do you value Ben Simmons and how do you directly correlate that with your value of James Harden? So I don't think it would have been a 1-for-1. I think there probably would have been something else involved on either side. But regardless, that's just speculation. That's now officially a what if, since James Harden is now a Brooklyn Net. And of course, this all ramped up after James Harden's comments after his team's lost on Tuesday afternoon, basically saying the team is not good, the team is unfixable, he doesn't know what he can do. To me, it kind of felt like when you're doing a handyman job. Like, maybe let's just see, you're fixing the plumbing of your sink and you're at it for about 15 minutes and you just don't know what you're doing. And then you're saying, screw this, I'm just going to go call the plumber like I should have at first. That's kind of what this felt like from James Harden. It also sounded like he was going through his social media or his media day kit that organizations give players at the beginning of every season. Big pamphlet saying, this is how you treat this question, this is how you should treat this question, this is what you say in this situation, this is what you don't say in the situation. Also known as your media training package, I guess. That's what they give these college players when they first bring them onto campus. It literally sounded like James Harden was reading off of a script and checking off all the things that he could say that would make him look less like a devil than he was about to make himself look when he forced himself out of the Houston Rockets franchise. And so he's like, well, I love this city. I've given everything for this city. And he did play 8 seasons in Houston, and he gave them some very good seasons. But for him to make the claim that he left it all out there for the team, That strikes a bone with me. I don't agree. He choked in the biggest moments. He looked uninspired in his biggest moments. Um, James Harden's a me player. He was never going to win a championship with the Rockets because of that. So to say that he gave everything to Houston, I think that's a little bit of confirmation bias, I think, from James Harden. Um, let's talk about all the other teams involved before we specifically talk about the Nets and the Rockets. The Cavaliers received Jarrett Allen and Taurean Prince, as I said earlier, and they send Dante Exum to the Rockets. I don't think he's going to stay in a Rockets uniform, at least for one season. I would actually waive Dante Exum. I think the Cavaliers sneakily got much better in this trade. Obviously, everybody's hyper-focused on the big names, and in some parts, focused on Karis LeVert, who is now in Indiana. That's a very interesting dynamic. But not only did the Cavaliers get rid of Dante Exum, who I consider to be a tremendous bust, considering that he was the number 5 pick in 2014, went to the Utah Jazz, and he's had a very quiet NBA career. Now, granted, that might be a little bit unfair because he has had injuries. He tore his ACL. He had some shoulder surgery. But considering how high he was picked, to only be averaging under 4 points a game for the Cavaliers this season, a Cavaliers team that's not that great. They don't have an all-star apart from Kevin Love, who I don't even think was an all-star last year, but he obviously he is an all-star talent when completely healthy. And then there's Andre Drummond as well. But other than that, the Cavaliers team, especially in the backcourt, with Garland and Sexton got injured. There is playing time for him there. So for him to only be averaging under 4 points a game, I think that speaks to his lack of talent. He's a bust for me. So glad that the Cavaliers were able to get him out of there, move him along. And, Dante Exum, you say, well, the 2014 draft wasn't really that good in terms of talent, but he still was drafted higher in a bad draft. He was drafted higher than Julius Randle, Marcus Smart, Zach LaVine, Yusef Nurkic, TJ Warren, Clint Capella, and I pretty much consider all those players to be better than Exum at this point. So good move by the Cavaliers to get him out. He wasn't contributing like you hoped he would be, even on a team with depleted talent. So good to get him gone. Jarrett Allen is having his best season as a pro. He's younger. He's more athletic than Drummond is. And of course, Drummond is on the last year of his contract after being traded by the Pistons last season. He's on the last year of his contract. So you either have a complimentary player to Andre Drummond or you have his replacement. So Drummond is still a great talent. He's still in his prime at 27 as well. I think a lot of people forget how young Andre Drummond is. He seems a lot older than he actually is. So you can turn Drummond into some more players or a few more picks by the trade deadline, or you can try and pair Jarrett Allen and Drummond together. That definitely would be a pretty exciting, definitely a very strong defensive front court there for the Cleveland Cavaliers if you decide to keep both of them. But I don't think that will happen. I think Jarrett Allen is probably going to end up being the king in that situation. I think Drummond might not want to be in Cleveland anyways. He definitely was surprised when he got traded by the Pistons late in 2020. I don't really feel any type of way about Taurean Prince. I didn't know too much about him. If anything, he adds more clutter to the Cavs front court. I believe he plays power forward, but I don't think things are going to stay as is. So, until he could probably find a pretty established role in this lineup like Dante Exum was hoping to find. They play different positions, but that idea that anybody can find sufficient playing time on a rebuilding franchise is there. So maybe he can come in and find himself some good playing time. But overall, I think the Cavs can be good again in about a year or so, so watch out for them. Jarrett Allen is a sneakily good pickup for this franchise, and I think they did a really good job of picking and cleaning players, needle in a haystack out of this gigantic blockbuster trade. The Pacers trade away Victor Oladipo to Houston and receive Karis LeVert. This is the acquisition that I feel the most indifferent about. For most part, it seems like a 1-for-1 to me. Oladipo and LeVert are similar in age. LeVert costs about $4 million left on the cap hit. Same position. LeVert is a little bit more of an on-ball player than Oladipo was. So if anything, you get Oladipo, who didn't want to be in Indiana anymore out of the organization, and you bring in a player of equal value or near equal value. Now, as far as LeVert's game is concerned, he really could be a nice fit with pick and roll with Domantas Sabonis and Miles Turner, who they are having great starts to their seasons. Sabonis specifically, he's having a great start to his season. I don't know about you, but just off the top of my head, thinking about the Pacers starting lineup, Malcolm Brogdon, Karis LeVert, TJ Warren, Domantas Sabonis, and Miles Turner, that sounds like a pretty dang good starting lineup, if you ask me. And with these scrappy Eastern Conference teams, you know that they have some really good developed players off the bench. Indiana could be one of those teams very well that has no real all-stars, but is still very well coached and can steal a playoff series from you if you aren't careful. They've already proven they can win games this year. They've started out 7-4. It's too early to say if Indiana got better with this trade overall, but at the very least, you end up with the same talent ceiling, and you get the superstar or the former all-star that you had on the roster out, who was disgruntled. You get him out of the roster, and you get a replacement in him, in somebody that could potentially be just as good, if not better. So, general thoughts just for the big boys involved. Again, we're going to talk specifically about the Rockets and the Nets by themselves in a different segment on the show. Obviously, if you're listening on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and Anchor, this is all going to be one for you. But if you're watching the highlights on YouTube, make sure you talk about the other segments on the YouTube channel, because we're going to talk more in depth about the Nets and the Rockets in those segments. But as far as general thoughts are concerned, going to be very general about it, because for the Nets, it really reminds me of the 2013 trade that they made for Paul Pierce and Kevin Garnett. Obviously, Harden is a different caliber player, still in his prime in comparison to Garnett and Pierce, who were at the tail end of their careers, who were struggling, and who definitely weren't worth the players and the 3 first-round picks that Brooklyn gave to the Celtics. I mean, the Brooklyn Nets directly financed the Celtics rebuild for the next 3 years, and were able to deliver them a couple of Eastern Conference Finals appearances. Really, that one trade was probably, some would argue, one of the worst trades in NBA history, especially in the modern era. And the fact that the Nets are going to do it again is kind of just like a whoa, history really does repeat itself. But yeah, really reminded me of that trade. Harden gets reunited with his former coach in Mike D'Antoni in Brooklyn, and there's a lot of speculation about what the relationship between D'Antoni and Harden actually is. I think the relationship between D'Antoni and Harden is actually good, as opposed to the relationship between Daryl Morey and James Harden. I think a big reason why he wanted to go to Brooklyn, apart from being able to play with Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving, was the fact that he would get to reunite with Mike D'Antoni again. But Sean Marks, that's his name. Sean Marks, the GM of the Brooklyn Nets. I was flubbing on his name earlier. Sean Marks definitely pushed all of his poker chips to the table on this one. If the Nets don't win the title this year, they don't win the title next year, it's going to be probably one of the biggest busts in the history of the league. I don't see how with this talent you don't win a title. I mean, out of all the teams, out of all the big 3 big super teams, this is probably the one that looks most like a Team USA competing in like the Olympics or something. I mean, there's just so much talent on this roster. No real defense, no real bench, but still you would like to think that all you need is one of those players to have an on night, and the rest could just kind of facilitate through him, and they'll be okay. They've got no real defense apart from DeAndre Jordan, who is 32 now, so he's getting up in age. Most of their other defense in Allen and Prince went to Cleveland. So they really, as I said, they've sold their basement to install an attic. And they really shipped out pretty much every asset they had to get James Harden, which also leads me to believe that in the end, it is the Houston Rockets that will win this trade when we talk about it a couple of years from now. Speaking of the Rockets, this clearly was a move to get a disgruntled superstar out of the city, out of the team, but more so when in the strategy behind moving Harden out of the city, this was clearly about cap space and options. You got a good piece with an expiring contract, which is really important in Victor Oladipo. Karis LeVert just got a new contract in this offseason, so it makes sense if you're opening up cap space and you're trying to manage your money that you would trade him away to Indiana, get a similar player in Victor Oladipo. As I said earlier, Oladipo and LeVert are currently in similar places, so you basically got the same player, but without the future cap hits that LeVert would have brought you. You got the big distraction out. The team won its first game without Harden last night against the Spurs. Spurs are not the best team in the Western Conference, but they're definitely a middle-of-the-pack team that are going to be contending with the Rockets for some of those later, those lower-seeded playoff spots, which I do think the Rockets are going to end up being a playoff team without Harden. We'll see if that comes to fruition, but that's just my gut feeling that now that you got the big distraction out of the room, you're going to be much, much better off. I think Houston played this perfectly. They didn't do the deal at the beginning of the season when Harden expressed his disgruntled attitude. He wanted out. He wanted to go to Miami, Philadelphia, or Brooklyn. They didn't do that trade at the very beginning of the season. They said, we're going to try to work it out, but they also were able to wait until the perfect moment to strike a deal, and that happened to be Spencer Dinwiddie of the Brooklyn Nets. One of the key players that are not named Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant went down with an injury. So you're catching Brooklyn and Sean Marks when they're vulnerable, when they're desperate for players, and they really feel like they need that extra all-star. So Houston was able to get an absolute haul from Brooklyn just by waiting. I don't think they would have gotten this much if they did this deal at the beginning of the season and things hadn't happened. Of course, you don't want Spencer Dinwiddie's injury to be the catalyst of a business transaction. I mean, that's awful for him, and of course we hope he's okay. I believe it's a torn ACL. Maybe somebody can correct me on that. But this deal would not have been as good for Houston if they did it at the beginning of the season. So the Houston Rockets played this perfectly. They got a lot of draft picks, a lot of cap space opened up, and it ended up being really, really good for them. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching this segment from the Hard-Headed Sports Podcast. If you're interested in watching more highlights from the show as they come out after the show's completion, you should definitely hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell to turn on those notifications so you never miss an upload. If you're interested in listening to the whole show in its entirety, you can listen to the show on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and Anchor. Again, thank you so much for watching the show. I hope you have an incredible day, and I will see you all very soon.